me, it looks like we're right about at 4 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. People are still coming in. Chris, as our first webinar of the year, you are very popular, you and your topic, and hopefully people have been waiting for our series to come back on. So welcome everyone who is coming in. We've missed you. We will start as usual with our land acknowledgement to acknowledge the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Diné, and Jicarilla Apache people whose traditional homelands we're working in here at Crow Canyon. Our work is not possible at all without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. And we respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to everything that we do here and to all of humankind. We are so grateful, and we support the protection and preservation of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. Thank you so much to all of our partners, Indigenous and everyone out there. If you have forgotten about Zoom over the holidays, which I doubt, if you have questions during Chris's talk, please jump in and put them in the Q&A part. People will probably be chatting in the chat. I will be chatting in the chat with folks that we haven't seen for a while. So if you put them in the Q&A, they don't get lost in the fray. We are live streaming on Facebook if you would like to jump over there if you are done with the Zoom. And this will be up on YouTube along with the rest of our past webinars, so please subscribe if you haven't already. We're so glad to be back. We have so many fantastic, thank you, Taylor, and all of our speakers coming up in the next few weeks. Next week, day after Valentine's Day, we will have Raphael Biguet talking about Diné, being and seeing through storytelling. And then after this, we have an artist talk with Anna. And I'm just going to not try the last name. I have to work on it a little bit, but I'm incredibly excited to meet her, and I will offer my apologies for the challenging Navajo Greek last name that she has. Really gorgeous looking. Thank you to everyone. As you know, our webinar series is entirely free, but so many of you donate almost sometimes every time that you sign up for a webinar. We're so grateful. We've had this going since the start of the pandemic now. We thought it might get less popular post-pandemic, and it hasn't, just the opposite. Thank you so much for your donations. We use them to support the cost of this program and our speakers, and Taylor and all of the great work that our webinar team does. So thank you. We have some really exciting opportunities coming up. As you know, one of our signature programs at Crow Canyon is our internship program. Chris and I were just chatting that he was at Crow Canyon in 94, 95 when I was an intern as well. So many of our staff and many prestigious people in the discipline have once been interns at Crow Canyon. So we have some great funding through an endowment for our interns. Thank you to all of the people who have funded our intern endowment. And we have a whole bunch of opportunities. We have in American Indian initiatives, zoo archaeology, we can be in the field, the lab, education, and outreach is a new one this year. We have we do so much digital work now that this is the first year we've ever had an outreach intern. So please take a look at those online. If you're interested, it really is a lot of fun. You learn a lot of things. You don't just get stuck in the lab. You get to, if you're a lab intern, you get to go and see what everybody else is doing as well. So it's a really fun group. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Chris Pierce, who has his PhD from University of Washington, has worked as an archaeologist from 1975 until the year 2000. His research focused primarily on the Western US, ranging from Paleo-Indian times through European contact, and covered lots and lots of areas, including method and theory, ceramics, experimental archaeology, geoarchaeology, and he changed careers after Y2K to healthcare research in informatics, and has worked for the Heart and Vascular Institute at the Cleveland Clinic, where he managed the observational research, clinical quality, and the informatics team until he retired in 2021. Congratulations on the retirement. Since retirement, he's been rekindling his engagement with archaeology, and you fill me with hope, since I hope to do that eventually, as primarily an administrator in my current position at Crow Canyon. So welcome, Chris. It's so great to see you, and thank you so much for joining us for our first webinar of the year.
Thanks, Liz. All right, I will share my screen now. Okay, can you see that? Yes. All right, so I'm happy to be here and talking about corrugated cooking pots. After many years of not working on this problem, I am working on it again. And so this talk is going to be covering some of my old work and some of my new thinking. All right, so before I get into that, I want to acknowledge some help that I've had over the years. Mostly, I'm grateful to the people who made and used these pots back in the ancient times. Without all of that, I couldn't be working on this problem. The work that I did was supported by Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in the 90s, and there were a lot of people from board members to staff to volunteers that played a role in all of that. The Bureau of Land Management was instrumental in getting me access to collections that I analyzed. Clint Swink, an artist and pottery replicator, produced pots for the experiments that I did. I worked at the Primitive Technology Laboratory at the University of Arizona to do some of my tests, and then finally received funding from the Colorado Historical Society and the Standard Products Foundation. So this talk is going to be broken into two parts. The first part is going to be reviewing the corrugation problem and its history, and that's going to be maybe a third of the presentation. And then the rest of it is going to be reviewing various explanations for the rise and demise of corrugated cooking pots. And so let's get into it. So the corrugation problem. The earliest cooking pots in the Southwest, or at least in the northern Southwest, begin around the mid-500s and look like this. They're scraped plain pots built up with coils, and that technology lasted until the mid-800s and was gradually replaced by an early neck-banded variety of pots where coils on the neck of vessels were left unscraped or unobliterated. And this is an example of that, where their coils are just stacked up one on top of the other. Very little or no overlap. And then this transitioned into neck-banded pots that both had overlap of adjacent coils, usually also extending down farther onto the vessel body, and some experimentation with punching and indenting and sizing along or across those coils. And that started in around 850 and lasted until about 1000, when indented full-body corrugated cooking pots spread across the northern Southwest, Colorado Plateau region primarily. And that transition happened fairly abruptly and quickly. And then after 1300 or so, they still made corrugated cooking pots, but then started smearing them. So you get this smeared corrugated from about 1350 until 1450 or 1500 or so. And then finally, a complete return to fully scraped plain cooking pots up to the point of contact with Spanish. So there were no corrugated pots in the Pueblo cooking pot assemblage at the time Spanish arrived in the Southwest. So this is the problem, going from plain through neck banded to corrugated, through smeared, and back to plain, that should be explained. The first people to, first Westerners, I should say, first Europeans, Americans to identify indented pottery or corrugated pottery were Frank Cushing and William Henry Holmes, who were part of early explorations to the Southwest and observed the occurrence of indented pottery on ruins that they visited. And Holmes was the one to coin the term corrugated pottery for these kinds of pottery. Both of them saw the lack of corrugation in historic Pueblo pottery and the association with black on white wares as evidence that corrugated pottery was the earliest form of pottery, and that it had that appearance because they were trying to make something that looked like basketry. Stratigraphic excavations and seriation of pottery assemblages in the early 20th century proved this assumption about early corrugation to be incorrect. In 1936, in writing up his work at Pecos Pueblo, Alfred Kidder proposed the first sort of more complete explanation for corrugation, and that is corrugation as art. Basically, Kidder assumed that the corrugations provided no useful purpose, that it didn't do anything to improve the performance of pots, and it was purely the people playing with craftsmanship and doing things for the pure joy of elaboration. In the 1940s, that explanation of corrugation as art was challenged by a different kind of explanation, one that said that corrugation did provide a purpose, a utilitarian purpose, by increasing the exterior surface area of the vessel. And the assumption was that this would improve heat transfer from the fire to whatever you're cooking on the inside of the pot. And this was first published in 1941 by John McGregor in his book on Southwestern archaeology. When I came into Southwestern archaeology in the mid-1970s, this was pretty much the assumption that everybody had about the explanation for corrugation. That began to change in the mid-80s with some experiments performed by Mike Schiffer and Lisa Young and Tammy Stone, where they made some small replica pots and tried to measure whether there was improved heat transfer, and neither of them could find any evidence for that. So people began to question whether this was a good explanation. At the same time, there was a reaction against the sort of functionalism of the new or processual archaeology that had dominated the discipline for many years. And people began to emphasize the role of human agency and the importance of things like social, political, and symbolic meanings. And so there was began to be a shift in the way people thought about corrugated pottery, and more people began to see it as a potential symbol of ethnic or other group identities. So this was a situation in the 1990s when I started working on the problem. And I thought we didn't really know enough about the technology involved or about the performance characteristics of these different kinds of pots. So I proposed as part of my dissertation research to do three things: a review of the literature that was out there to see what could be gleaned from already published data, detailed technological analyses of 6 well-dated grayware assemblages from sites in southwestern Colorado where the transition from fully plain to indented corrugation was pretty well covered by existing archaeological record. And then a bunch of experiments designed to measure manufacturing costs, cooking effectiveness, and vessel durability. That work, in addition to resulting in a dissertation, resulted in two publications that I show here, one on the technological aspects of the change from plain to indented corrugation, and then one on the experimental results and the cost and performance properties. So I'm going to briefly talk about the results of this work, but if you really want to know more detail, you should go look at these publications. So the literature review was challenging because mostly archaeologists in the Southwest document pottery by assigning them to types. And the types aren't a particularly good way to understand technological change. Most of the types are designed to tell time and not to understand technology. So there were only a few things I could get at from the review that I performed, but one of these things was the earliest appearance of indented corrugated pots. And the map on the left side of this slide shows what I was able to glean in the 1990s about the timing of that spread. And you can see how it began in the southern San Juan Basin based on some pretty sparse evidence, but that's what it looked like at the time, and then spread rapidly out of that area and into north of the San Juan, into the Fremont area, and then eventually across the Little Colorado and the Rio Puerco into the Rio Grande Valley and the Mogollon region. This should be updated if somebody wants a fun project. The technological analyses, through that I was able to document the gradual shift in the use of exposed coils and indented corrugation. The graph on the left shows in these 6 assemblages the percentage of pottery based on weight of sherds with exposed coils. So you can see that it starts off slow and increases through time, so that by the time in the 11th century that people were adopting full body indented corrugated pots, almost all of the grayware assemblages were corrugated. This increase is a result of both the number of pots that have exposed coils and the extent of the exterior surface of the pots that have exposed coils. The chart on the right shows exposed pottery, coil pottery classes based on 3 attributes: the amount of overlap of the coils, the height of the exposed coil, and whether they're indented or not. The classes on the left are the no overlap, large, relatively large, more than 10 millimeter exposed coils, and no indentation. Classes on the right are just the opposite: greater than 50% overlap, less than 10 millimeter high exposed coils, and indented. So you can see that there was this change through time as new techniques were added. And in the 10th century, just a wide variety of things were done in the exposed coil domain. And then finally, in the early 11th century, almost everything was indented, highly overlapped, narrow coils. In my experimental work, I did 2 different kinds of things. One was trying to demonstrate the cost differences by measuring the time it took to form each of the pots. So I gave Clint Swink, who made these pots, specific instructions on the size and shape and construction techniques. And he used those consistently across the 24 pots that were made, 12 plain and 12 corrugated. And we looked at, monitored which ones were made first, second, third, fourth, and documented that corrugated pots take significantly longer to make than plain pots. Eric Lindman has argued that just the opposite is true, but that was not the result we got. And then we used these pots to test various performance aspects of the pottery and divided into several categories. So one of the things I wanted to look at was whether permeability of the vessel wall affected how the pots performed. So I did two kinds of contents, plain water and cornmeal mixed together to make a mush. And then on some of the pots, I lined the interior surface with pine pitch. And so the graph on the left shows the results of numerous cooking experiments using those different kinds of pots. So the x-axis on this is the grams of water absorbed into the vessel wall through the course of the cooking experiment, and as a measure of vessel wall permeability. And the y-axis is, or the vertical axis, is the minutes it took each pot to reach peak temperature. And these were heated with gas stove under controlled conditions. And you can see that the corrugated pots without lining, cooking water, were the least effective at heating the contents. Plain pots with no lining, heating water, were more effective, but still not great. But as vessel wall permeability decreased, so we've got the lined vessels here, cooking water, and then we have all the different pots that were cooking mush, lined and unlined, were the most effective. And there's really no difference between plain and corrugated pots in terms of heating effectiveness if they're used to cook mush, which infiltrates the vessel wall and reduces vessel wall permeability. The reason that plain corrugated pots boiling water are the least effective is that, yes, that extended surface on the base improves the heat transfer into the pot, but the extended surface above the heated zone also increases the release of that heat to the environment, which actually is a greater effect than the improved heating. Through the course of these experiments, I also found in an anecdotal way that handling hot pots was a lot easier with a rough corrugated exterior than with a plain exterior. I then, after conducting these cooking experiments, subjected several of the pots to extended use cooking, where I cooked for thousands of hours until some began to fail. And two of the plain pots failed completely. Two others developed cracks, and only one of the corrugated pots started to develop a crack after thousands of hours of use. So based on that, I determined that corrugated pots are more durable than plain pots. And there's good engineering reasons for that that you can read about in the published work. The pictures on top here show what happens when one of these kinds of cooking pots fails. You get thermal gradients through the vessel wall, create stress through the vessel wall that actually results in the exterior surface being pulled away from the interior surface. So when a pot like this fails, you end up with odd breakage, very diagnostic fracture pattern, and sherds that are lacking one surface, which later I call spalls, and we'll get back to that. So that's where we stood by the end of the 1990s in terms of what we know about the corrugation problem, but still unresolved is why these changes in cooking pot technology occurred. So that's what I'm going to address in the remainder of this talk. And to do that, I'm going to do something that is a little different. I'm going to try and develop some good explanations, good hypotheses. Simply identifying that something might have a benefit, some utilitarian benefit, is not sufficient as an explanation. So what makes a good explanation? Well, first, you've got to identify some causal mechanism that might have been involved with whatever that benefit is, if a benefit is what you're using to explain. And then you have to embed that explanation or that causal mechanism within the specific historical context that you're working with. And that usually is done through some kind of narrative construct. And then finally, that explanation, that hypothesis, should specify novel predictions that can be measured in the archaeological record, although not necessarily only the archaeological record, so that you can actually test your ideas. And finally, you really want to have more than one of these. So the explanatory theory that I work from is called cultural evolution theory. And in this theory, culture, one of the reasons for culture is that it is a means of producing, transmitting, and filtering ideas and behaviors among people. So change in this theory occurs through the operation of various mechanisms that generate and filter ideas that are transmitted between people. Some of these mechanisms are analogous to ones that people talk about in biological evolution, while others are maybe unique to people. So I'm going to propose 4 different possible explanations, and I'm going to talk about each one in turn and where we are in thinking about each hypothesis and what evidence there might be for evaluating them. The first one is the mechanism is unbiased transmission, and the idea is that this is simply a matter of stylistic drift. The second one is intensification, here subsistence intensification, and the mechanism is content-biased transmission. And I'll discuss, as I talk about each one, I'll talk about what some of these theoretical mechanisms mean. Third one is socio-political inequality and context-biased transmission. And fourth, polity formation and costly signaling. So let's get into it. So hypothesis 1, stylistic drift from unbiased transmission. So although I documented cost and performance differences between plain and corrugated pots, it's certainly possible that these didn't have any effect on the change over time, either because the payoffs were not sufficient or the historical context didn't produce any benefit for those different payoffs. In this situation, unbiased transmission, then people learn from a random selection of the people around them. And this is unlikely to occur in reality, but it's a good way to model things, a simple way to model things. And quantitative stochastic models of unbiased transmission have shown that in large stable populations, change over time can occur without any force shaping it other than random choice of transmission, and that this change produces a unimodal curve over time. And these are the curves that underlie the seriation dating in archaeology. And the graph to the right shows painted pottery types in the 6 greyware assemblage sites that I analyzed, and you can see examples of these unimodal curves through time. There are situations in which unbiased transmission can result in a single trait or a single type being not selected, but being driven to what's called fixation, where everybody does it rather than being a lot of variation. And that the normal situation where that occurs is in very small populations. And this is called a founder's effect in population genetics. So predictions of this theory is that, or this hypothesis is that trait frequencies in time should be unimodal in distribution unless there's been some kind of founder's effect. And the spatial distribution of traits should follow patterns of interaction within and between populations. So when we try and test this idea, we can look at the various classes of exposed coil techniques that I produced through my technological analysis and look for unimodal distributions. And in fact, we see something that looks like that for the early neck-banded varieties. It looks like it conforms to that unimodal pattern. But once indented corrugated pottery comes in, almost everything else goes away, and it lasts for almost 300 years with almost no competition. And so that's what we would call fixation of one variant over the others. So for that to happen as a result of unbiased transmission would require there be some kind of founder's effect. And although there is a lot of interesting population dynamics that happened during the 10th and 11th centuries in the northern Southwest, it's not clear that there's such a substantial decline in populations that would produce a founder's effect. In addition, the later return to plain cooking pots through smeared corrugated also coincides with a period of a large population dynamics and relocations and possible declines, but again, not sufficient to produce fixation. But a lot more could be done with that. But I would say at this point, there is some evidence for the early changes, the development of exposed coils and neck banding conforming to an unbiased transmission model. But the whole corrugation dominance of indented corrugated pots later, probably not. One of the things that we can also look at is the spatial patterns, and we see that, as I mentioned earlier, a rapid spread of indented corrugation across the northern Southwest. But in some areas, such as the Rio Grande and the Mogollon region, it took a lot longer for that technology to get there. And in many cases, it didn't completely replace other forms of cooking pots. So this is possibly an indication of patterns of interaction. But again, it's something that we would have to look at in a lot more detail to evaluate, but it's intriguing. Okay, hypothesis 2, intensification and content-biased transmission. So content-biased transmission means that there's some property of the variants or traits being transmitted that causes their bias or selection. And in the case of corrugated cooking pots, I'm arguing that intensified boiling of complex carbohydrates like beans and corn, and beans and maíz de ocho, which is a variety of corn well suited to grinding into meal, came on the scene just as cooking pots were becoming common in the archaeological record and become a greater part of the diet over that time that corrugation is being developed. And that the argument here is that intensive cooking of these things, of these complex carbohydrate food sources, was part of a larger intensification process that was part of the transition from mobile part-time farmers to settled agriculturalists. And several other workers in the Southwest have identified this transition, and it involves many other aspects of technology, including groundstone and cooking features and so forth. So the argument here is that cooking intensification would have accentuated the payoff of even small differences in cooking pot cost and performance, and that these conditions, this intensified cooking, led to the selection of enhanced cooking pots that had enhanced utility, such as the indented corrugated pots. So predictions of this hypothesis is that there should be evidence of increased intensity of cooking pot use during the period that exposed coil and corrugation technology were being developed. There should be evidence that corrugated cooking pots actually improved the utility of these pots. And then the spatial and temporal variation in the adoption and use of corrugation should coincide with the intensity of cooking pot use. So when we look at the first one of these, the evidence of increased intensification of cooking, we start by looking at some indirect evidence. The graph on the left shows the gradual increase in the size of cooking pots through time in the 6 assemblages that I analyzed. So larger pots, meaning more food was being produced in this manner. Or that's one way to interpret that trend. The graph on the right shows the proportion of bowl sherds as part of all pottery in numerous assemblages from southwestern Colorado. And you see an increase over time, a gradual increase over time in the frequency of bowl sherds. And these bowls presumably would have been used as serving vessels for the food being cooked in the pots. So seeing both an increase in the size of cooking pots and the increase in the relative abundance of bowls suggests that cooking and consuming foods cooked in pots was increasing in importance through time. More direct evidence of intensification in cooking comes from the pottery itself. So recall in the experiments with the pots that fractured that we saw that spalling effect of the surfaces being pulled apart, producing sherds that have only one surface preserved. And in addition to that form of use damage, there's also use wear that is produced in cooking pots. At the base of the pot, the interior surface of the base becomes pitted over time as tiny little chunks of pottery pulls away from the inside surface. So in the 6 assemblages that I analyzed, I looked at both the presence of spalls and the presence of pitting in the pottery assemblages, and found that both increased over time into the 10th century and then began to decrease substantially with the adoption of full body indented corrugated pots. So this suggests that intensification of cooking did increase over time. And then the adoption of full body indented pots had an effect on the amount of pitting and spalling that occurred. However, the sample size is small. There's potential biases in the collection and retention of pottery with spalled surfaces. So should not get too excited about this data, and a lot more analyses should be done. But currently, multiple lines of both indirect and direct evidence suggest that there was intensification of cooking going on during the period of the development of indented corrugated cooking pots. To look at evidence for increased durability, which was the main difference between plain and corrugated pots that I found, the best way to look at that is to see if there's any change in the rate of accumulation of cooking pot sherds in trash deposits through time. And to monitor that rate of change, you have to compare it to something else that may be more constant through that time. So to do that, I compared it to the amount of chip stone debris produced through making of chip stone tools in the same assemblages and the same deposits. So compared the weight of grayware pottery to the count of debitage or chipstone debris in numerous 41 different assemblages from southwestern Colorado. Now, one complicating factor of this comparison is that the early assemblages, the grayware pottery in early assemblages includes many more types of pottery, forms of pottery than cooking pots. The graph on the right shows the transition to slipped and painted pottery through time. So the decrease in the abundance of graywares corresponds with an increase in the abundance of whitewares. And so that whitewares, most of the non-cooking pot forms transition to whitewares over time, leaving later grayware assemblages being almost entirely cooking pots, whereas earlier grayware assemblages includes bowls and other kinds of jars and other vessel forms. So to control for this, I tried to adjust the abundance of grayware pottery in early assemblages by factoring out the proportion of other vessel forms. So the graph on the left, graph A, shows the change through time in that accumulation rate. And even with that adjustment, the earlier assemblages from the 9th and 10th centuries show higher rates of accumulation of grayware pottery when compared to later assemblages, suggesting that, in fact, there is a change in durability of cooking pots, and that it was sufficient that the users would have noticed this difference. Finally, we can look at the transition back to plain cooking pots. And this coincided with a shift away from boiling of cornmeal to the making of breads. So we see this represented in the archaeological record in a number of ways. The introduction of technology around bread making and bread cooking, change in the configuration of hearth features, and that it more or less coincides with the shift back to plain pottery. However, it doesn't well explain why that transition would include a period of smearing of corrugated pots. That's still a unexplained feature of the transition in this hypothesis. Okay, so hypothesis 3 says that inequality and context bias transmission was the reason for the adoption of cooking pots. And in context bias transmission, it is the properties of the transmitter or the model, such as prestige or something of that nature, rather than the aspects of the pottery, in this case itself, that led to the likelihood that different traits would be transmitted and adopted. So in this case, if there was an increase in inequality among pueblos and more prestigious individuals and households provided models for people adopting technologies, and these more prestigious folks were early adopters of corrugation technology, that could explain the more widespread adoption of that trait. There is some evidence for increasing inequality in the Southwest. The graph on the upper part of this slide shows the Gini index from Kohler et al. That shows increases in the Gini index, which is a measure of inequality based on house size. And the photo in the lower right is, of course, Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon, which is likely a very good example of inequality. So predictions of this hypothesis, if it is true, we should see the high status households in communities taking on the corrugation technology first, and that technology would spread to adjacent lower status households. We might be able to see this on a community level. We might also be able to see it on a regional level. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any evidence on a community level that will allow one to evaluate this idea. And it's possible that temporal resolution may be insufficient to even distinguish it at that level. However, on the regional scale, it may or may not be a coincidence that this indented corrugation spread out of the Chaco southern San Juan region into adjacent areas. And with Chaco Canyon being the center of this sort of inequality and the spread of that Chaco system, may suggest that these prestigious individuals modeling the technology could play a role. But the fourth hypothesis looks at that same thing in a different way. Here we look at polity formation, and namely the Chaco polity, and costly signaling as being the reason. So costly signaling is a way of mediating communication among individuals that share interests that are interdependent. And the reason that costly signaling is important is that it discourages dishonest transmission. If you have to invest a cost into some kind of signaling, you're less likely to fake it. And as the Chaco polity developed in the 9th through the 11th centuries and expanded spatially, the signaling of participation in that polity may have taken on a heightened importance. And corrugated pottery, because it is more costly to make, could have been a signal of participation in that Chaco polity, as might have Degozi painted design styles and potentially many other aspects of material culture. So with this hypothesis, we might predict that the spread of corrugation across the Southwest would correspond with the first appearance of traits of the Chaco polity, such as great houses, roads, etc., and that the spatial extent of the adoption of corrugated should match the area of the Chaco polity, and that the discontinuation of corrugation should coincide with the collapse of the Chaco polity. So this map shows the extent of the Chaco polity as commonly recognized, although there is certainly debate about the boundaries of Chaco. And you can see that corrugations spread well beyond what is typically considered part of the Chaco polity, especially up into the Fremont area, but also into the Rio Grande, into the Mogollon, into the Little Colorado. So this suggests that perhaps being part of Chaco is not a defining feature of the use of indented corrugation. However, on the transition back to plain pottery, it could help us explain the transition involving that smeared corrugation. If corrugated pottery is linked to Chaco symbolically, the end of Chaco could be, and the rejection of Chaco by Pueblo people and everything it represents might be interestingly reflected in the smearing of corrugated pottery. So that's a possibility that needs further investigation. So that's a lot of ground we've covered. Clearly, we're just at the beginning of this process of explaining corrugated pottery. It's an iterative process. We propose, we speculate about causes, we identify ways of measuring these things, we go out and look, and it helps us refine, and we just keep turning that wheel until we get better and better knowledge. We definitely need more work on refining and developing these hypotheses and potentially others from other theoretical perspectives. Identifying crucial tests or critical tests of the hypothesis needs to be done. And then we need to actually go out there and look at pottery assemblages from around the Southwest to help actually evaluate these different ideas. The importance of taking this sort of explanatory approach is that it helps us identify many potentially productive lines of investigation. Just in this talk, we could spin off numerous studies, and that resolving some of the questions being asked will result in the identification of new problems and new questions that will help us further refine our knowledge of the past. And that's it. Thanks.
Wow. Chris, that was fantastic. This is definitely one of those webinars where I feel like we need 2 hours, even though, studies show that people mostly won't stick around for 2 hours. So we try to keep it to one. But first of all, thank you so much going on in that presentation from the material culture itself to the experimental archaeology. Mike Shiver was on my committee. I miss him very much, and now he's writing novels for anyone who wants to buy them. They're fascinating. These post-archaeological careers. I'm just going to jump right to some questions, and I put in the chat to folks to go ahead and email me if you want to continue the discussion. I can facilitate that interaction with Chris. I'm going to jump to one of our listeners, our viewers who put so many questions in the chat that I think that comments that she deserves some time, and also because I'm a little bit of a fangirl of Janet Liverwood. I love your work, Janet, your sculpture and your pottery, and I was recently at the Turquoise Raven Gallery and saw some of your work, and I hope to save up and buy a piece someday. You're so talented. So there's a bunch of questions that I'm going to try to kind of put out there and tell y'all a little bit about Janet, who is a potter and who notes in the Q&A that she's done reproductions of some of these corrugated pots and looked at the different materials that would reduce spalling and cracking and pitting, et cetera. So to give you a little bit of context for Janet's questions. So one of the ones that Janet popped in that I thought that really I was interested in that as well, when she talked about your hypothesis number one, that there's been a lot of written and oral histories around transmission from mother to daughter. One individual can change her style, and what follows would that characterize what you call founder's effect, and that change in techniques is slow and conservative, and why would you see change in something that seems to work? And Janet, if I didn't quite ask that right, just pop some notes in the chat for me.
All right, well, let me try and take that in parts. So founder's effect is a population level phenomenon, not an issue of individuals. So the transmission from one potter to another, if you take thousands of people doing that, then you can look at something at a sort of a founder's effect level. This is not to diminish the importance of those sort of individual level interactions. It just is very hard for us as archaeologists to look at those things. We see population level characteristics in the archaeological record. Rarely do we see individual level things. Of course, individuals are making and using these pots, but seeing those sort of detailed transmissions events is very hard for us.
Right.
I'm trying to remember what the second part.
The other part was kind of about why change, right? When something seems to be working.
Well, that's a good question. So if something works, but something comes along that works better, so you might change. If something comes along that doesn't work any better, a lot of study has gone into that people just change for the heck of it. It's well modeled by a random process. What's called stochastic. When you have a random process over time, we call that stochastic. So that basically there's no reason. People just do it. And not just people, it happens in other animals, and it's a phenomenon of life, actually.
True. My dad is a sociologist who says people make no sense whatsoever. He studies people in the present, possibly true throughout time. I want to jump in because we have Dr. Blindman. Eric Blindman is on, and he asked, he said one of his favorite observations of your research was the functional benefit of neck banding and the control of boil over. And is that still a factor in your mind, or have you changed your mind?
Yes, it's still a factor. in an hour talk, I thought I couldn't cover everything.
Of course.
But yes, I think if we're looking, especially in hypothesis 2, where intensification is and content bias transmission is going on, you want to see some improvement all along the way. So even though the specific techniques may be well modeled randomly, the fact that we see exposed coils extending down the vessel body, we would want to know why that is. And one of the features that we found was that pots with extended coils on the upper body were 30% less likely to produce boilovers because of that reduced heating effectiveness. That upper body was radiating out so much heat that it actually reduced the amount of boilovers, so gave greater control over cooking. Which I think when you have a giant pot, which, you know, the pots I used, I have one here, they're not that big. they're pretty small. But if you have a really large pot, like Pueblo potters were using and cooks were using, that could be a substantial issue.
Right. Okay, I'm gonna, if you don't mind going just a couple minutes over, we're 2 minutes over. I thought I would jump to a little bit more of a regional question. Tons of questions about temper and clay and materials, which are all really fascinating too, but I'm gonna, for diversity's sake, and I'm gonna try to summarize a couple more of them, or a bunch of them. So regional patterns, right? So we've got questions put up from a number of people. Hello, Reuven, who's in charge of our lab. What do you make of the common corrugation of bowls in the Mogollon region, vessels that were not used for cooking? And these things may not be related, but I'm also going to just put out there while you're contemplating that, about people making observations about seeing corrugated in Hohokam sites, Salado sites, regional distributions of corrugation at different times. And I know that's kind of a strangled question, but I'm just gonna throw that in at you and see if you have any observations there.
All right, well, let me start with the Mogollon bowls. I think they're a fascinating corrugated variant. I don't think that we can necessarily say they weren't used for cooking. I don't think those studies have been done. They have interior surfaces that would reduce permeability, and I think it's entirely possible they were used for cooking. They also, but it isn't necessarily the case. If you follow Steve Lexon's notion that Chaco people moved south through the Mogollon region, the appearance of corrugation down there later and potentially in forms that aren't cooking pots may be linked to that. There are so many questions about the regional patterns of corrugation. I think when you get into Hohokam and Salado, there's definitely some true corrugation. Hohokam, it's a rare trade wear, but there you have something similar in that you have pots that have roughened exterior surfaces that I think could be very analogous. Cooking pots with, I forget what they call it, plastered or something like that, where the exterior surface has been made rough. And that's really the key. That's the key to greater durability. That's the key to greater cooking control, is having that roughened exterior surface. So there may be other forms, other ways of accomplishing the same thing that appear in other places.
Excellent. I think I'll end with kind of a question kind of around descendants and oral histories. And I know there's a ton of literature out there, but sort of for you specifically, Have you interacted with modern Pueblo communities or people or potters who have an opinion on corrugation as it relates to their practice and some of
I
your
haven't.
hypotheses as well?
I think, at the time I stopped doing archaeology in 2000, there wasn't as much opportunity for that kind of interaction
Sure.
as there is today. I would love to have that kind of interaction, but I haven't, unfortunately.
All right, all of the graduate students out there listening, we have there's so many projects, particularly involving looking at the kind of Western scientific modeling that's been done, and the opportunities to talk to current potters and descendant potters as well. So much amazing work and information to be shared out there. So I'll let everybody go. Taylor, if you will save the chat and the Q&A, just because there's so much great stuff going on in here. And
Liz,
yeah.
Is it possible for me to answer through the Q&A after it's saved, or is that something I
Taylor,
would have to do now?
That's a question
I
for
can
Mike.
work with you on that. It depends on if they entered their email address when they logged into the chat today. So I will do my best to connect you with those folks.
Okay, because I'm happy to answer. I know there's a lot of questions we didn't get to.
And then I am sending out your email, Dr. Pierce, as part of our follow-up messaging today. So if you guys do have questions that did not get answered live, you will be receiving an email in about 30 minutes that will include Dr. Pierce's contact information. So you're welcome to forward your questions to him directly.
Yes, that would be great.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. What an incredible start to the season of webinars. And Chris, we're probably going to drag you back at some point for some follow-up, given the level of interest and questions and comments. So
well,
fantastic.
I'm actually starting to do some more work on this, so I might have updates someday.
Come out. We have Clay and as you recall, a laboratory. And anyway, it'd be really fun to host you as a visiting artist and scholar. So
all right.
We will welcome you at the home for wandering archaeologists.
Thanks. All right. Well, it's been my pleasure.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks, everybody.